This talk was prompted to some degree by the last talk we had, which was by Dr. Steve Taylor of Leeds Beckett University, and he's a specialist in science and spirituality, something I find particularly fascinating. And he spoke about two things principally last time. He talked about something he called post-traumatic growth. And these are events in people's lives, usually quite traumatic, difficult, painful experiences, which somehow trigger realizations or uplifts in consciousness for people, and usually are the result of accidents, losing your job, going to jail, something of that kind of order, life-changing experiences. And he said that these experiences often produce what he calls ego dissolution. That means your identity, your primary identity suddenly starts to become fragmented and starts to fall apart. And this really struck a chord in me, because in my own case, and in the case of many people I've spoken to, it is these events which appear in your life and can appear very, very destructive and appear very disruptive as well, because essentially an old identity disappears and a new one appears. And as I wrote in my introduction to this particular talk, each one of us goes on a very different spiritual journey. And I'm not going to speak for too long today, because I'd be very interested in listening to some of your experiences. And although this is a personal spiritual journey, I don't propose to turn it into a confessional, that the sort of thing you might get in those magazines on the top shelf of the supermarket, you know, my drugs and booze hell, my life with Katie Price and that sort of thing. It's not going to be that, but it's going to be certain milestones on the way. And once we start to recognize what these milestones are, once we start to understand that these events, which appear very unpleasant in our lives, can actually be real opportunities in disguise, then I think that this is going to be of great help to people. Because often people go through these things, and it was true in my own case, that people start to feel like victims. And this is a terrible thing, because victimhood is something which a lot of people feel, and we hear about it a lot in the media. I mean, the media love to create victims and make people feel small and useless, basically. When we realize that we're all on a particular journey, and when we've all been through particular events, and when we start to look at these in a different way, I think this is tremendously helpful. And not only that, not only does it help our spiritual growth, I think it has a therapeutic effect as well. And when I've spoken to people throughout my life, particularly over the last 10 or 15 years that I've been involved in the Theosophical Society, there is a definite and recognizable pattern that seems to happen in people's lives. And it often happens typically in middle age. People have what we call in Theosophy divine discontent. They can appear to have everything that many people aspire to, but there is an emptiness. There's a hole in their lives. Something is missing, and people often don't know what that something is. And I'm going to try and explore that. And I'm sure that many of you, as I say, have had similar experiences to this. I've called it hubris, nemesis, redemption, because my life can really be separated into three parts. And the final part, the redemption, is for me the good part, but the other parts were just as important. I think the first spiritual experience I ever had was probably when I was quite young, 5, 6, 7 years old. And I used to go out with my parents for walks on Sunday afternoons, and we often used to walk around churchyards, and I'd look at the old ivy-covered gravestones, and I'd often wonder why some people lived to be 100 years old and other people died when they were very young, and no one seemed to be able to provide any answers to this. And I asked my parents, and I asked the teachers, and I asked the vicar at the church where I went to what this was all about. And of course, they couldn't answer these things largely either, because they didn't particularly understand them. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, we just moved house and I went to a new school, and I was playing football in the schoolyard with a number of my classmates, and suddenly something happened. I don't know what it was, but I suddenly felt disengaged from this football match and just walked away and stood by the wall. And my friends were saying, "Come on, Tim, it's your turn to be in goal," or whatever it was. And as I stood there, it was almost like I had some kind of out of the body experience. And I got this overwhelming feeling that I'd been here before. I don't particularly mean in that schoolyard or even in that town or in this body, but that I had experienced life on earth at some other point in my life. And it became an overwhelming and, well, feeling of conviction, in a sense, that this was just part of a much longer process, that this was just one tiny chapter or even a sentence in a book. And I couldn't explain it at that time. I couldn't apply any logic to it and explain what it meant. But it was a very, very profound experience, and it lived with me for a long time. When I was 10, I had a catastrophic accident, and I was extremely ill for many weeks. I was in hospital. My face was a complete mess and covered in stitches, and I had to have operations and various other things to repair the damage. And this too provided a different perspective, because when I was lying there, again, I had these kind of experiences where I was almost floating out of my body and looking down on myself objectively. It's almost like my soul had detached from the physical vehicle which carried it in this life, and I was able to see my life in a more objective way. I'm explaining this to you now in a particular way. I didn't understand what was happening then. It just seemed very weird and very discordant at the time. But now I know that it was a definite signpost, that this was a very important event for me in some ways. And I think it is very important that we recognize that a lot of the bad things that happen to us are actually revelations of some kind. They are little mini initiations that we go through in our life. What do we mean by initiations? Well, initiations are not ceremonies where you wear strange costumes and take part in all sorts of group activities. Initiations are uplifts in consciousness. They are sudden increases in your own awareness of yourself, of the world, and many other things. Nothing much else happened to me until I got to the age of about 15. And then I started to read things. I actually tried to read Madame Blavatsky when I was 15 or 16. I borrowed a copy of The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled from the local library. And of course, trying to read that at this particular age is a somewhat impossible task. But nevertheless, it resonated with me, and I started to read all sorts of other things at that time as well. Occult things, Dion Fortune, Aleister Crowley, of all people, and that kind of stuff. And I had many, many different experiences when I was reading this sort of stuff. And then I went to Thailand at the age of 17 as a teacher. And there I also had a number of experiences, particularly when I went to places like some of the Buddhist temples and the sacred sites, because it was so different from any kind of religious tradition which I'd been used to. I'd been brought up in the church, but had been basically divorced from that for a few years. My severance with the church was when I got expelled from the choir for reading Batman comics during the vicar's interminably boring sermons, which no one particularly understood. So then, up to my early 20s, this interest developed. But so did my career. I became involved in journalism and editorial work as soon as I came back to the UK. And then I went through a period of perhaps 25 years until my early 40s, where things were basically just almost confined to the material plane. I worked for different newspapers, different magazines. I worked for the BBC. I worked for ITV, Granada Television, and various other things. And I'd reached a point where my life outwardly seemed to be very successful. I was in a particular relationship, the children involved, had a nice car, nice flat, and all these things. But like a lot of people, I started to feel this complete dissatisfaction, as if the life I was living was almost illusory in some ways, and that it was not the real life that I was meant to be living, as if I was in a particular dimension and there were other dimensions which I needed to somehow explore. And one of the earliest signs of this was when I was covering the war in Bosnia in about 1993. I was with a small party of people from the United Nations, and we were in a part of northern Bosnia called the Krajina, which was a completely lawless place. There was devastation everywhere. And we were on our way to try and find a group of about 30,000 people who'd been displaced and were refugees and were living in all places in a chicken farm. And suddenly we turned a corner in this vehicle. There was a cameraman, a woman from the United Nations, and myself in this particular vehicle. We got separated off from the rest of the party. And we came to a checkpoint, which was manned by Serb soldiers, most of whom were about 18, armed to the teeth with all sorts of weapons. And they were also extremely aggressive and, to make it worse, extremely drunk. And they kept us at this checkpoint in the boiling hot August sun for a number of hours, and they wouldn't let us go. And there was no authority here. There were no police. There was no law and order at all. And essentially we were quite vulnerable. Journalists were being killed in these kind of situations all the time. And eventually, after some hours, they kept poking guns into the car and threatening all sorts of things. I said, look, I've got to go out and go to the toilet. And one of these guys said, if you do that, I'm going to shoot you. And I thought about this for a moment, and I should have been absolutely scared witless, but I wasn't. I was very scared afterwards, but at this point, it was almost as if, again, I went out of my body. And I thought, if I give in to this man, he is going to kill me. So I got out of the car and I thought, if he shoots his gun, I'm not even going to hear that bullet because it'll be traveling faster than sound and it's just going to go straight in my head. And at this point, again, I went out of my body and I started looking down on the scene below. And I went behind a wall, relieved myself, and luckily he didn't shoot. And 10 minutes later, they let us go. This was the precursor to a series of events which then started to unfold. And I began to realize that this was a kind of pointer, that the life I was living was needlessly dangerous. I was putting myself in all sorts of risks. And for what? For a couple of minutes of television, which people are going to, consume like an apple and then just throw away the core. 2 years after this, these feelings had intensified, and it was 1995, and I found myself in a churchyard in the Isle of Man. And we were filming as part of a series of documentaries I was making. And at this point, I knew things were going badly wrong in my life. And I was sitting there just in this churchyard on a June afternoon. And the cameraman was off just getting some shots of gravestones and that sort of thing. And in the graveyard was a standing stone about 7 or 8 feet tall. I've tried to identify this churchyard since then, and I can't. I've been through pictures of every church in the Isle of Man, and I simply cannot find it. But it wasn't a figment of my imagination, it actually happened. And leaning against this gravestone was a man with his hand just against it. And I walked up to him and I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Look, just feel the energies on this stone." And I thought, no, this is nonsense, you know, the man's a bit crazy and everything. But nevertheless, I did it. I put my hand on this stone. And at that moment, my life changed completely. I suddenly felt this jolt of energy like I've never felt anything before. It was like electricity. It was like, if you ever had an electric shock, it was as powerful as that. And at that instant, I knew that everything in my life was going to change. And it did. I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but basically my relationship collapsed. I lost my job, I lost my flat, I lost my money, I became homeless, started doing all sorts of things that I perhaps in retrospect shouldn't have done. And for a very long time after this, probably for a period of 10 years, I felt completely lost and as if everything had been stripped away. Exactly what Dr. Steve Taylor described as ego dissolution. All the outward trappings of my life just unraveled completely. And I thought, why is this happening to me? I've done nothing to deserve this. But that gradually put me on another path, and I started reading various spiritual things again. I started studying ancient history, philosophies, religion, and so on. And eventually, about 10 years later, I came to Theosophy. I was working on a local paper and I met Cynthia and Atmatrazi and started writing about the Theosophical Society and started going on to their meetings. I didn't join straight away. But then, once I started getting into the teachings, it began to fall into place what was happening to me. And rather than feeling like a victim, because I'd started to understand the concepts of reincarnation and karma, I realized that all this was part of a continuum. I knew that life wasn't imposing things upon me, but that I, through my own actions and deeds and thoughts and all the rest of it, had created a situation in which I now found myself. And for the first time, I stopped blaming other people for that. And things gradually began to fall into place again. And it was almost like I had a spiritual awakening. It didn't happen as dramatically as some of the previous events in my life, but over time, it began to make some kind of meaning to me. It produced a coherence that I had brought myself on this particular journey to this point, and now I had to deal with it. And this is what happens to many people in life. They get all these terrible things happening to them, often, well, usually quite unexpectedly. There are occasions when these things are not entirely negative, but in 9 out of 10 cases, I think they are, and bad things happen to people. And people then start to resort to going to their doctor and being treated for depression and all sorts of other things. I've suffered from mild depression during the whole of my life, not in any way that's been debilitating, more like a kind of low-level melancholy. But I've never been to the doctor because, I mean, I knew that doctors can't heal these things. We can only really heal ourselves. And when you tap into this wider knowledge, and when you understand that there are principles, timeless principles, which can be applied to yourself, it's a huge, huge liberation for you. So I went from a feeling of victimhood to one of almost liberation. And I was speaking to someone about this the other day, and this person said to me, depression is almost like a cry of soul. And this, I think, is a wonderful phrase, because that's exactly what it is. And after 10 years of this kind of wilderness existence, things started to rebuild again. And I started to understand that I was actually in charge of my own life. And this is the powerful thing about Theosophy and similar traditions. You are not just some flotsam and jetsam floating around the earth or through the universe. You have the power to be in control of your own destiny if that's what you choose to do. And, you know, depression is something which I think can be applied in a spiritual context. Because if it is a cry from the soul, what does that mean? Well, in Theosophy, we understand that there are essentially two parts to us. There is our transient personality, the lower four principles we talk about in Theosophy, our physical body, the etheric body, our astral body, and our lower mind. And then there is the soul, the higher self, the individuality which persists from life to life, consisting of our higher mind, the sixth principle of wisdom, intuition, which we call buddhi, and then atma, spirit. And what a lot of people don't realize, and they would liberate themselves if to a greater extent if they did, was that there is often a permanent war going on between the personality and its desires and the soul and its desires, because the two are often entirely incompatible. I know that most of us realize that our aim is to integrate this lower self with the higher self by building that bridge, which we call an antakarana, the rainbow bridge, the conduit or the connection between the two. Unfortunately, not that many people are able to do this, and it's an extremely difficult job. The lower self, the personality, the transient personality, has one set of desires which are all based on me, 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 me. I want this, I want that, I deserve this, I should be doing that, I need a better relationship, I want a new car, I want to do this, that, and the other. And then there is the purpose of the soul, because each of us comes into this life with the soul purpose. And I think one thing that wakes people up is when they realize that there is some underlying purpose or purposes to their life, because we set ourselves these targets, these goals at the start of each new life. We come in with certain missions to fulfill, certain adventures to undertake, certain lessons that we have to learn, certain skills that we have to acquire, certain debts that we have to pay off, certain karmic obligations which we have to discharge, usually in conjunction with other people. I started to realize when I started to research death that we all belong to soul groups of reincarnating egos who've probably been together in different situations with each other in the past, sometimes as friends, sometimes as families, sometimes as rivals, business associates. The relationships can be many and varied. And we keep coming across these people again and again and again. When I started researching regression therapy into past lives, again and again and again, people who go back into previous lives where this is possible, realize that their incarnation is not just down to them. Any particular life is not just down to them. It's done in conjunction with others, because we are part of this family of souls. By group, a group of egos, I don't mean a group identity the way that animals have it, because we as human beings have individualized souls. Animals are still part of group souls. I'm talking about a family of souls. So if you come across someone in your life who is an avowed enemy, someone you absolutely detest, you can bet your life that you have been involved with that person in some way in the past. Similarly, if you feel very attached to someone, if you feel an instant attraction to someone, you're introduced to someone at a party, or you come across someone even on the street and you feel an instant attraction or repulsion to this person without knowing why, without there being any logical or rational reason for this, you can bet your life that there has been some interaction between you and this other person in a previous life. When you realize these things, then victimhood doesn't become an option anymore. And really, when you think about it, and this is controversial, I've had people at meetings shout at me over this. When you say that really there are no victims, they say, well, this is terrible. Of course there are victims. There are people that get things done to them and it's entirely unjustified. But the problem is we don't know what has happened to people in other lives. We don't know how other lives have impacted on the circumstances that we find ourselves in this life. And until we start to recall previous lives, which most of us don't, then this becomes a bit of a mystery. And so you have to basically take a leap of faith and say, okay, I accept the fact that I've been here before. I accept the fact that I'm here and I'll be here again. And we have to take it that there have been things which have molded and shaped our lives, just the way that we are molding and shaping our future lives by our conduct, by what we try to do in this life, by the way we treat other people. And this is why fundamentally all religions say this, even religions that don't believe in reincarnation like Christianity. They say the fundamental law is to treat other people as you would wish to be treated. And there are very good reasons for that. So when we go through these painful experiences, and if we're able to come through them, and I feel very, very privileged that I was able to learn these things, because otherwise I think I would have gone crazy. I feel very privileged that I was able to put all these events into some kind of continuum and derive some kind of meaning from them, so that I could see that I was definitely on a path. And all this stuff that had happened to me, and all this stuff that happened to the many other people I'd spoken to about it, because they had had similar experiences to me, did have meaning. These are not random, chaotic, accidental events. They happen for a meaning, they happen for a purpose. There is no effect without a prior cause to it, even if we don't know what that particular cause was. And once we start to realize that, this is an extremely powerful tool we can use in our lives. And I'm very, very grateful to Theosophy for teaching me this. And I think if more people were able to apply these things, they could make their lives much more pleasant, much more creative, much more productive. So my life starts with this long period of time up to the age of about 40, which we'll call the hubris part, the pride, the arrogance, the ignorance, thinking that you are the center of the universe. Then comes the nemesis, the retribution, the unfolding of all sorts of unpleasant events in your life which you don't recognize and which you don't want and which you wish you could avoid. Then you realize there was no way of avoiding them, because if you avoid these things in a particular life, okay, you can do that. But whatever happens, you still have to confront these things head on at some point. And I think Theosophy and other traditions teach us that if we put off learning a lesson at a particular time, we still have to learn that lesson. And it might even be more harsh, more unpleasant, more challenging, more difficult the next time round. So over the last 10 or 15 years, my life has been much better than it was in the previous period, because I've been able to reconstruct it in all sorts of positive ways. Theosophy now is my job. I've created a job for myself in terms of writing and lecturing and doing all sorts of other things, organizing conferences. And I must say that also Theosophy is a family. You know, its first object is to create the nucleus of a brotherhood of humanity. And I think most of us here would agree with that. And most of the people with whom I associate now are people who would embrace those ideas. I'm not saying they're all Theosophists, but they all have a similar worldview. that we are essentially spiritual beings who happen to find themselves in human bodies, and not human bodies who happen to have some kind of spirit attached to it. And one of the interesting things that I found quite a long time ago was that a lot of the old relationships I'd had with people, professionally, just as friends, these started to fall away because I could no longer talk to these people because they didn't have the same kind of aspiration. I remember one of the first talks I ever went to was by a man called Eddie Billamoria, who is a wonderful man, very knowledgeable man. And the thing he said at this particular seminar was, avoid negative people. And it just struck me and it resonated with me this in a very, very powerful way. Because these negative people can bring you down. And when you're vibrating at hopefully a slightly higher level than you have been before, you can no longer communicate in the same way with these people because they think the only meaning of life is to acquire money, get a better house, get promoted at work, build up a big pension fund and all the rest of it. And they don't see the deeper purposes to these things. And so our relationships with other people can profoundly affect our lives, and we have to be very, very careful about who we associate with. Another of my close colleagues is the esoteric astrologer Ted Capstick, who talks about something called quantum entanglement, where we become involved with other people and we vibrate almost on the same level as other people. So we have to be very mindful about the situations that we put ourselves in, the type of people that we involve and wrap our energies around. We have to be extremely careful about this because as we're growing, we need to have the freedom to grow and not be shackled by people who have a much more basic and materialistically inclined view of themselves and a materialistically inclined view of life. This is very, very important, and this is why groups like the Theosophical Society are so important, because they do provide a forum for like-minded individuals to explore these kinds of ideas. I've also become much more aware of the world I live in, not just this human world that I live in, but that we're part of a living being. We are part of a planet which is a living, breathing entity with its various kingdoms of nature. And I think that if more people were aware of this, if more people realized that their thoughts and their actions and even their emotions impact upon the world that we live in, the world would be a very, very different place. Because we don't only shape the world through our physical deeds, we shape the world with our emotions and desires. The world has an astral body, and it also has a mental body. And that mental body is constructed by the collective thoughts and emotions of everyone who's alive in that particular world. So this is another uplifting consciousness which many people I've spoken to have experienced. They become much more aware of nature. They have different relationships with their pets, with their friends, with their families. And sometimes, as I say, you have to let people go out of your life because these people are having a very detrimental effect upon it. But above all, when these various things happen to you, the kinds of things that I've outlined in general detail to you, you have to respond to that. You have to be sensitive to the fact that these things have happened for a particular reason. And you can't go back to the old ways of doing things. You have to constantly recreate yourself. And I'm sure all of us know people who really don't change very much year in, year out. Yes, they get older, their bodies start to wear out and everything, but essentially mentally and spiritually, they are the same as they've always been. and they don't understand that there is this absolute imperative for us to grow. That's why we're here. That is the meaning of life, to grow and to evolve, to experience things, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent, and really synthesize that experience, learn from it. What are the lessons of this? What have they taught me? What do I still need to learn? What is my sole purpose in this life? When people do that, it does have a profound effect on people, and their physical health improves, and certainly their mental health improves. And all of us here today will be very aware that the mental health of many people around us is in very bad shape indeed. You know, we are reaching epidemic levels of mental illness in all sorts of different ways. And much of this, not all of it, much of it can be alleviated and understood and rationalized when we start to see it in spiritual terms. And also, much of this mental illness, as indeed with other disease, will have, to some extent, its roots in our past lives, and these are the karmic obligations that we have to go through. These are very, very powerful ideas. They're very difficult ideas to communicate to many people. As I'm sure you're aware, when perhaps you've tried to explain these things to other people who are not inclined in this way, they tend to mock you. They tend to laugh at you and look on it as some kind of airy-fairy spiritual notion, but it isn't. This understanding of one's own spirituality is possibly the most powerful tool that any of us have at our disposal. But like everything else, like every other skill, and as with every other tool, we have to learn how to use this. We have to learn how to apply it. I think I'm going to stop there because I would really like to listen to your stories if you're prepared to share them with me. And I'm sure some of you will have had not the same experiences as me, but similar experiences which perhaps you misunderstood to begin with, and you thought were tragedies and thought made you a victim, thought you didn't deserve. Well, maybe all of us, maybe we get exactly what we deserve. And it's when we can't change the circumstances of our lives that easily, but what we can do, all of us, is we can reassess the way that we react to these experiences and deal with them. And when we realize that we are essentially spiritual beings, that gives us the ability to do this, because we know that this life in physical bodies is very finite, can vanish at any moment. We've had many lives before and presumably will have many lives again. When we can become creative people, when we can co-create with the universe and cooperate with our own destinies, that's when we really start to become liberated from the shackles of the lower personality. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that it may have been of some small help to people, but as I say, if you have anything that you wish to share, I personally, and I'm sure other people present, would be fascinated to hear it. So thank you very much indeed.